Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm your host, Gary Gellman. As I mentioned earlier, Frank Cipolla is here, radio network news anchor and former anchor for News 12 New Jersey. Frank, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Frank, you've been around the TV and radio news area for well over 2 to 3 decades. Tell us how you got started.
How I got started was something that really doesn't exist anymore. I started at a small radio station in Warren County, New Jersey. Back then, all the stations in New Jersey, Gary, were individually owned, or owned, a gentleman owned one or two, whatever the case may be. But this particular one was owned by Nick DiRienzo. It was in Warren County, New Jersey, in Washington, Warren County. It was it was actually a house that had an antenna out in the backyard, and the owner lived upstairs. So it was really an old-fashioned radio station, which really in this day and age doesn't exist because a lot of them are part of conglomerates and so on. Clear Channel owns 1,400 of them, or I think they own 900 now. But it really was an old-fashioned radio station where you could make all your mistakes, have all your bloopers reel forever, and you learned the craft. You really learned the craft.
Let's go back a second. How did you get into radio? What made you interested in being a radio journalist?
I'm actually blessed. I decided at the age of 10, when I was 10 years old, that the only thing I ever wanted to do was be in radio or television news, specifically radio, because I thought it was the most amazing thing. Because you went to work and you didn't have to dress up.
If you're in radio.
If you're in radio.
Okay.
If you're in radio. You didn't have to dress up. You spoke to a lot of people all at once, which really fed the ego of a young man like myself. And you have to have an ego to be in this business, it's clear. And you learned something. I actually went into the business wanting to be a disc jockey. But I realized from watching disc jockeys early on that the repetition was kind of boring. You know, you played the same 40 records again and again and again, and there was so much you could say about Elton John or you know, Billy Joel. But the news aspect of it, and that really was my first job, because I wanted to do news with the idea of transitioning into becoming a disc jockey. But I fell in love with news because every day I was learning something new. And it wasn't the repetition of being a disc jockey, and that's what I really, really enjoyed about it.
Now, where'd you go to college?
I went to college at St. John's University in Queens.
And you were involved in their multimedia program there?
Well, back then it wasn't called multimedia.
Yeah, I guess it was either TV or radio.
When I went to college, it was called the radio station.
Okay.
It was a great place to be on the air and a great place to meet chicks, quite frankly, because they were attracted by, you know, the guy who was on the air. So it was a small radio station above, at that time, St. John's had a Rathskeller, which was a bar, essentially. They don't have them, I don't think, anymore. And I know they don't have them at St. John's. In fact, it is a health club now. But back then, you could go downstairs after class and have a beer, and sometimes a band would come by and play some music. Right above was a very small office. We had been shunted to the corner of the building. There were just 2 or 3 very small offices, and one of them was the studio. And we broadcast from there.
Now, let's go back to Warren County for a second. I know your first job at the radio station, you had some real fun stories, and you actually worked with some pretty famous, now famous people.
Yeah.
Tell us about working that first job in Warren County.
The first job, you know, till this day, I have dreams, and I'm 50 now. Till this day, I have dreams about walking around that station. I mean, I still see it in my mind's eye. It is long since gone. It burned down years ago. It doesn't even exist. But in my mind's eye, I would say maybe 4 or 5 times a year, I'm walking through that station and I see the owner and I see the colleagues I worked with. It had such an impression on my life, Gary. It really was the seminal point of my entire career. I was so blessed to be at that station, that very first station, because there was a cast of characters there that you not only learned a lot, but you really had a lot of fun. And it really got me hooked because the first job was the most fun I ever had.
Now, how would you coordinate that with now in 2009? What type of atmosphere is the radio station or TV station in this time?
The station's now corporatized. What they are is they're chains of stations. Lots of times you'll go into a station in the Midwest, there won't be anybody there because the entire programming is coming out of Los Angeles or San Francisco. There's really no local aspect to it. Back then, there were about 45 stations in New Jersey, and as I mentioned, each one of them was sort of individually owned, and they were owned mostly by men. And I remember that once a year, they were very competitive. We were very competitive. Our competitor was WRNJ in Hackettstown, New Jersey, which was about 10 miles away. And you know, we always wanted to beat them on the story, and they always wanted to beat us. In fact, the news guy at that time was a guy named, I believe it was Lee Grant, but he was the son of Bob Grant at WABC Radio. And, you know, we used to do everything we could to throw him off base, and he'd do everything we could do to throw us off base. But the owners of the station, they'd be very competitive during the year, but once a year, they'd go down to the New Jersey Broadcasters Association meeting in Atlantic City, and all of them would get drunk, stinking drunk. They would hug, they would talk about each other, and then they'd come back to the stations, and they go right back to being very competitive. It really was a competitive feel there.
Right.
I mean, I can remember in the newsroom we'd call up the competitor and pretend like we were somebody else just to throw him off the track. You know?
Right.
So it really was a lot of fun.
So what were the stations like? Were they mostly music? Were there a lot of news stations in New Jersey at the time?
The big stations back then were WCTC in New Brunswick, WOBM in Ocean County, WHWH in Princeton, and WMTR in Morristown. They were really the cream of the crop. All of us were sort of second tier or third tier. We didn't feel that way, obviously.
Right.
But you know, it was an environment that, again, can't be repeated. It cannot be repeated.
And how many years were you there?
I was there for 2 years, a month and a day.
And then what happened?
And the reason why I say that is because I was back then a man in a hurry. In this business, if you stay at one place too long, for lack of a better description, you get a stink about you. The owner of the bigger station is saying, well, why was that guy there for 8 years? Was he not good enough to jump? I knew that I had to spend 2 years here, 4 years there, 2 years, 9 years here, before, I had a plan. The plan was I'd stay at WCRB for 2 years or a little more and leave. And I knew exactly at 2 years it was time to go.
You worked with someone who's now heard daily in New York. We're going to take a break. We come back. Who was that before we go?
That's the great radio news anchor and has been at WCBS Radio many, many years, Wayne Cabot.
Wayne Cabot.
Wayne Cabot.
We're going to take a break now. We come back. We're going to talk about the fun you had with Wayne Cabot. We'll be back after this. Frank Cipolla is here. We'll be back. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm your host, Gary Gellman. My guest today is Frank Cipolla, network radio news anchor, here to talk about his life as a radio, TV host in New Jersey. Frank, before we went to the break, we talked about Wayne Cabot, who you worked with at the radio station, who's now on CBS News. Tell us about Wayne and working with him early on.
Wayne was and is one of the great broadcasters of this city. And I don't say that because I know him 30 years, because he is. He's one of the longest tenured news anchors at WCBS All News 88 in New York. I've known him obviously 30 years. But back then at WCRV, I was there about a year or so. It's maybe 1981. And the owner of the station, Nick DiRienzo, who was beloved by me and everybody else who worked there, brought in a new kid that he found at one of the high schools. And here comes this lanky 6'6" kid coming in here and with the voice of God. Even then, he had the voice of God. You hear him every day, but even back then, he had this low baritone, and we were all very impressed. But essentially, he was a kid. He'd come to work in the morning on a moped. I'd be on the air getting ready in the newsroom, and I was all of maybe 21. I thought I was the veteran back then. And, this kid would show up at 17 years old on his moped, and get on the air with this wonderful baritone voice, which we were all impressed with. But we knew even then, it was clear to everybody who worked with him, including myself, that he had a wonderful career in front of him, and we all knew it. We all knew it.
So what are some of the stories? I mean, I know you had the relationship there, and you spent a lot of time with him. Any fun stories you want to share?
Well, I not only spent great 2 years working with Wayne, or 2 years or so, but I've come in contact with him over the years because we're in the same industry. We talk about the moped. One day I was getting ready to go on the air, and Wayne was nowhere to be found. And so now I had to become disc jockey and newsman, and I'm like, where's Wayne? Where's Wayne? He came in. He had fallen off his moped on the way to work and had like a big bloody scar here and a half Band-Aid that he got somewhere at a CVS on the way in. He fell off his moped. We don't know how. Voice was saved. Didn't hit his throat, but he fell off the moped.
So, go ahead.
And with Wayne, there were always things that we were thinking of. Again, we were essentially kids, and we were having a lot of fun, and that fun led to a lot of schemes, a lot of things that we thought of. The famous jelly donut story, which
I read about that. Why don't you share that?
Yeah, we had a very nice man by the name of Dave Kelber. Dave Kelber was Wayne's teacher, and he headed up the radio department at the local high school where they found Wayne working, and Nick found him and brought him on the air. But Dave, as a favor of the owner, used to come in on Sundays just before church in his Sunday best. and do an hour or two on the radio because Nick couldn't find anybody. Dave didn't need the money. He did it simply because he enjoyed doing radio. We'll go back the day before. It's a Saturday afternoon. Wayne and I are at the station, and we're sort of bored. Just, what are we going to do? What's happening? We had a gentleman who used to come to the station and bring us Dunkin' Donuts. And I don't mean one box, Gary. Sometimes he'd bring 8. It was a country music station. He loved country music. He wanted to be near the disc jockey, so he'd stop by. But every time he'd stop by, he'd bring these donuts. And sometimes it'd be 8 boxes of them. Anyway, back then the radio studio had what we call a scissor mic, a boom mic that sort of hung there. And on top of this microphone were these headphones that had 2, cushions at the end of them. Right. And we were just sort of sitting in the studio. We were off the air at the time because it was a daytimer station. And we were looking at these, 2 cushions at the end of your standard set of headphones. And we realized that they looked very much like donuts. And, it took about, from that observation, it took about maybe 15 seconds to come up with this harebrained idea at the time. We were going to pull the bottoms of the earphones off and take 2 jelly donuts, which were brought by that gentleman who stopped by, and put them on there instead, on the stems. And we did that. We put the jelly donuts on the stems. We hung them over the microphone. We even took a wire and sort of squeezed it into the hole where you put the jelly in and plugged it into the board. So it really looked authentic. Right. And we just sat there and laughed for about 20 minutes. We thought it was the most hilarious. And then something else, as 2 kids, something else caught our attention and we wandered away, Right. Went home that night. Monday morning we come in and we're doing the usual morning show, Wayne and me, and we get what we call in the business, we got hotlined. This must be the former owner of the station coming back as a fly to be in on the show. But we got what we call in the business, we got